let's also present now the partners we have here. So we have Emmanuel from bookRoom and then Renny and Thomas from Reflektor. Do you want to, Emmanuel, say briefly just something about the bookRoom?
Okay. So bookRoom is an experimental research and publishing platform which is based at UCA in Farnham in the UK, University for the Creative Arts. So we engage with editorial, curatorial, critical research through a number of different activities which are related, PhD, research degrees, publishing, symposium, and other public events. So for the past, I think, 12, 15 years now, we have surveyed the parallel histories and practices of the photo book and the artist book within a post-digital context, and with a particular affinity maybe with a kind of artist book or photo book or publication that allows us, artists and writers, thinkers, academics, collectors, to operate at what I call the critical edge and on the margins maybe of more mainstream artist institutions, conventional publishing, and the usual and respective gatekeepers of all that. So in our publishing, we publish both, we have published surveys and anthologies of the evolution of publishing and also artist publication. And some of these surveys now, they are mainly out of print, but they are all available online as well. I will put in the chat the links to these. The Codex, Paper, Ink, Pixel and Screen, which was published in 2015. Then The Book is Alive in 2013. And a very interesting catalog called Rise with Your Class, Not From It, which is a catalog and a series of work around the working press, which was a publishing imprint from 1986 to 1996 about working class art, so which is published earlier by Joe Spence and other people. So all these are freely available online. So I'm very pleased to be part of this this project that Johannes is leading. And that's it.
Thank you. Yeah, and the reason for me also was I was suggested from Matt, our speaker from last year, to reach out to Emmanuel, and it's been super nice and to broaden also the audience for this, and so I'm really grateful. And the idea is also then to host the recordings of these talks on the bookRoom platform.
Yeah.
So that kind of.
And next talk will be by Emma Lambert, who's currently towards reaching the end of her PhD with bookRoom at UCA with a great project.
Yeah, more about that on Saturday, and Emma is also here in the audience, so that's super nice. Renny, do you want to say something about Reflektor?
Yes. Well, I'm Frini Hockenjos, and we are from Vienna, Thomas and I represent Reflektor, so one of the co-organizers of this great online series of talks. Though I have to say that Johannes did most of the work, but it's exciting to be part of it. And Reflektor is a platform. It's a non-profit organization with both photographers and photo book lovers. And we kind of promote self-published photo books and artists' books. And so we go to different festivals and fairs, both here in Vienna and internationally, or we host talks and photo book breakfasts and yeah, different kind of formats to further promote photo books, interesting publications, and yeah, to actually get this this discussion about photo books, get this continue to have this going on. And I don't know, when was it, Johannes? A couple of years ago, you published a beautiful photo book about your daughter, Lilia, and that is part of, that's also, you can, yeah, we have it still, it's still available from Reflektor. It's a very, very nice publication. And
Yeah, thank
yeah,
you.
that's
So yeah,
also how we met.
yeah, so I'm also a member of Reflektor. I haven't been much active, but it's nice kind of to be active in the way of these webinars now.
Exactly.
But yes, I could say maybe a few words still about the intention today. I really hope that the audience will feel like there's room for discussion and to raise any kind of questions. Might be that you feel in the audience that maybe some of the ideas or thoughts are dense, and that's completely also okay. And there's no I want to encourage different kind of level also of questions. There are no stupid questions. If you're curious about something, I would hope that this could be a space where we could address different levels of aspects to the photo book. And yes, today, so we come here to hear José Neves to engage with us with prompts and questions and thoughts about how to think about the photo book. And I'm really happy to welcome him here and to start these sessions of three talks with him. So I'll give the floor to you. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It makes me very happy to be here. And also the process to getting here was really fruitful. I love the discussions. In a way, you forced me to go back to my research, which was good. And I will talk about that, obviously, a lot. But I think, yeah, I'll explain in my introduction who I am and what I've been doing in the last few years. Also, I think that's quite a central element of it. But as you were saying, it's yeah, I think it's meant to generate discussion. It's meant to open lots of questions. I think hopefully that will be the core of this day, is that to not only discuss things here, but also even after these presentations. I think it's important to continue these conversations. And so I hope that, and because we're being recorded and it will be available, I'm completely open to people approaching me if necessary, also to continue discussions. So that's yeah, a big part of it, and why I'm so excited to do this today. And I think this forum is such a great idea. And the fact that it started, this is the second time you're doing it, but I think it's great that you thought about this. And I think it's really useful to have this platform. So yeah. So I think just start then by sharing my screen. Let's see if I can do that. Okay, so hopefully you can see it there. Okay. So, okay, I will just turn my camera off at the moment. See if I can do that here. Don't want to see. Stop video. Okay. So welcome again, everyone. So this is the title of my presentation, Unbinding the Photo Book. Before I was talking to the organizers just before we allowed people into the room, and I was looking at this image, and it's quite a potent image. So there's the pyromaniac in me took over, I guess, and it thought, okay, this is setting the tone for what's coming. It's not about obviously fully, being iconoclastic, not destroying the photo book, but it's in a way to shake the foundations of the photo book, or what we think about the photo book. This presentation is mostly about that. And so just to give you an idea of what I want to do today, the goal is to invite you to think or rethink this idea of the photo book. As you can see there in the title, the photo book is in air quotes, so the quotes are there, because I will enter a little bit of a discussion around terminology, definitions, the history and how it was constructed of photo book making, historiography in particular. And that's my background. I'm a photo historian by training. I spent my my academic research was around the subject, my master's and my PhD. I tackled all these ideas around what is the nature of the photo book, and trying to answer questions about when did this practice start, what defines it, and how did it evolve throughout time. The conclusion I reached was that this is perhaps not a stable form, although we might look at it in that way. Now I think after a few decades after the publication of central studies about the photo book, maybe that's not the case, but I think there's still a prevalent idea that we might know what the photo book is, and I'm not so sure we know. At least I don't know. So that's also something that I think would be really interesting to discuss. And so the goal, the introduction of this core idea of unbinding, but as a sort of a metaphor, but also in terms of practice. So that's going to be present in the following slides, and this will frame the discussions that I'm proposing in the next hopefully 50 to 60 minutes. And we'll think about the photo book as a genre, the form itself, and how we should interpret the practice. There are some provocations, some questions throughout this presentation that hopefully will, stimulate also questions. Or maybe you disagree with me. That's also absolutely fine. And I hope you disagree with me because that's the point too. So please feel free to disagree with me. I don't have the answers for everything. So that's the challenge that I'm throwing into the arena here. So this is I want to address this central idea that is present in this paragraph. It's about thinking about the photo book not as something like that is a fixed object, but an evolving and contested form of bookmaking. And so I will go through several parts in this presentation. First, talking about the history of the photo book, then terminology, and then thinking about unbinding and how do we get away from that, or should we get away or not? I mean, that's up to all of you to also think about that. And I want you to think about potentially new ways of engaging with the history and practice of photo bookmaking. Most of my research is around and aims to deconstruct established notions of the history and practice of photo bookmaking, and also artist books. Today I will introduce us a little bit, which is something I haven't done in the past. I did engage with the academic work done around artist books, the writing, when I was doing my PhD. And that is part of the PhD, but I was, for some reason, that never came through in most of the writing and also public presentations. And today I want to bring that into the discussion a little bit, because I think there are overlaps between both worlds, artist books and photo books. And Emmanuelle was talking about those two things when she was presenting her project. I think was really interesting. And I also want to bring that to the table. So I would like to start with the history. It's because the goal obviously is to discuss the unbinding of the photo book, which I will come to later. But I think we need to begin by grasping our comprehension of the history and nature of this type of bookmaking and how it has evolved. So I will start with the historiography, and how several studies have crystallize what we now call photo books in a sense. So and this all of this is not new. So, but I think we to think about the first moment where the photo book was studied and someone wrote about it. I would like to talk about Elizabeth McCausland's article, which is deemed the first time that someone wrote specifically about the relationship between the photography and the book. And it's a very interesting article that looks at production, distribution, and the relationship between text and image. And it's a first attempt to look at what is this specific object in the ecosystem of photography. And so this is this is it's not a well-known article. Some people have looked at it and obviously studied it, but it's not a lot has been written about it. Elizabeth McCausland was worked with Baroness Abbott, the photographer. They collaborated. They were a couple, and they collaborated extensively, and McCausland was fully aware of the form, and so was able to write. And then after this, there was an enormous gap in terms of research around photo book making or and trying to establish what that form was. Photo books continued to be produced after the 1940s and before the 1940s, but not many people were writing about them. And so part of my research while I was doing my PhD was going back and looking at these moments and people that had, studied the form. So I think one of a very important study is Goldschmidt and Weston Naif's The Truthful Lens. And it's a survey of early photographic books, 19th century photo book making, which is also part of what I studied during my doctoral studies, but also not well known. But I think obviously and I just want to say that this study looks at particularly at materiality, photographic printing, technology that allows photography to be in the book. So it's a very, very important study in that sense. And it was very useful for me. But the watershed moment, I think, are these studies that I'm showing here. Andrew Roth's The Book of 100 Books, and that was published in 2001. And then Martin Parr and Jerry Badger's The Photo Book History that was released in 3 volumes. And there are key differences between these two studies. Roth was and still is a book dealer. This is almost a commercial enterprise in a way. The study was created, the Book of 100 Books was created to establish a market, one could argue. Whereas Parr and Badger also, obviously, it's not innocent. The idea of creating a canon of photo books is also to make people aware of it and to create a market. But theirs is a social history of the photo book to a certain point. It placed the photographer at the center, and it talks a lot about artistic agency, the author, and the photographic medium. And this is, I would say, the moment that the photo book becomes part of, of the consciousness of the photographic world again, after so many decades with people's, buying photo books, but not really discussing them, not really paying attention to them and as we do now. So these are very important moments. And just to further contextualize this period, so especially Parr and Badger's study owes a lot to this publication by Horacio Fernandez, a Spanish curator. And this book called Photography in Print was a book that it was an exhibition, so it's a catalog. It's not a study about the photo book per se. It's a study about photographically printed publications or that have photographs in them. It's about the illustration of different forms of printed matter with photography. It's also not a general or domestic history of the photo book. It looks at the interwar period, but it looks at different forms of printed matter, magazines, annuals, and all types of publications that have photography in them. And I think the reason why it was important for especially Martin Parr was that when I spoke to him about this particular study was that the way the books had been photographed and displayed inside the pages of this book. So the fact that the spreads were photographed and shown on as illustrations, and that was what influenced then Martin Parr to do a study with Jerry Badger about the photo book. But and this is my view. It's unfortunately this idea of the interconnection between the book and other forms of printed matter with photographs was not taken on board when those studies were made, and that's okay. They don't have to, but I think it limits our perception of the photo book. Whereas this is a study about the constellation of things that surround that production that surround the photo book in a way, and even not arguing that the photo book is at the center of the use of photography or the relationship between photography and the page. But I think this is a very important study in the sense that it asks questions about how images circulate on the page, and that's not just about the book, but it's about other forms. But I will talk a little bit about that. And obviously there's another thread of research that deals with specific geographies and photo book making in specific countries or cities and so on that was done. And I can't talk about every single thing because I don't have the time here, every single study, but I'm choosing the most important ones to give you a context of this research. And this is Boom and Sermon's study of the Dutch photo book, Dutch documentary photo books. So it's very specific. And after World War II, those photo books that were produced after World War II, it's I would say less known, obviously. And there has been a second study about the Dutch photo book published more recently. The reason why it's influent, and I think the reason why I placed it here is because of this quote that I've used before in other presentations. This has been extracted from this book and placed in Martin Parr and Jerry Badger's study. And it really shapes their perception of what is the photo book. And obviously our own perception of what is the photo book. Not everyone agrees with this, but I think it is a good definition. It tries to extract the photo book from a wider production. And in a way, it's trying to distinguish what makes a photo book a photo book. And I think it's saying that a photo book has this artistic agency that I already mentioned that is present in Martin Parr and Jerry Badger's study, and the way that study is driven by the idea of the photographer as the agent, and that he creates a book that is an expression that is based on narrative, that is based on creating something that goes beyond a monograph, a book that is simply a collection of photographs. It is more closer to the literary book, or the idea of the cinematic, book where things have have a beginning and an end in the book. So it's a full body of work contained within the actual photo book. So my first provocation is precisely around this idea of constructing a canon, and the idea that the book needs to be central to the discussion. And I won't enter the discussion now. I will wait until the end, but this is my first question. How would that have changed the perception of the photo book we have if we had, instead of those studies becoming so important that they were just the foundation of the studies is the book, the codex, in a sense? What if Horacio Fernandez's study had been the fundamental point of that would have influenced the study of the photo book instead of Parr and Badger? And things obviously are what they are, but I think it's a good question to ask now that has been that 20 years almost, more than 20 years actually, that's roughly 20 years since they published the study 21. So that's my first question. I'm not sure. Maybe you noticed that I've highlighted in red some of the titles of the books, the studies I was talking about. It wasn't a mistake. It was just to sort of make you think about, now that I have the list of different terms that we're used to call, or name the work that was inside those studies. As you can see, we already have sort of 4 variations here. If that sort of binding of what is a photo book by the historians also, shaped how we perceive the photo book now, there's another element to it that has to do with terminology. And this is a very long discussion. I have a full chapter in my PhD about this, and I don't want to also spend my time talking about terms, but I need to talk about it because every time there's a discussion around artist books or photo books, we all tend to just start either adding terms to it or trying to, express ourselves by using different terminology or making sure that we define what we're describing very precisely. So I think that's some of the points I want to put across now about this second part of how the photo book became bound. The problem starts, and it started for me when I was doing my research around the photo book. Again, here using quotes. When I read this paragraph in Par and Badger's Volume 1. So they obviously asked that very important question: what is a photo book? And then they say the study focuses on a specific kind of photo book. So for me, there's it's almost it's a sabotage here of what they're sabotaging themselves by saying this is a photo book, but it's a specific kind of photo book. So my expectation was that every time we talk about photo books, we need to make sure that we're saying, oh, but I'm not talking about photo books in general. I'm just talking about a specific kind of photo book. So this raises the question, why do we call it a photo book and not something else? And David Campany, in 2012, wrote this article for Source Magazine where he tackles that specific issue. He makes a really good point here when he says, "Who dared to coin the term word book to make something coherent of books with literature or writing in them?" But nonetheless, here we are. Everything that has, I think it makes sense to say that books with photographs are photo books, are photographic books. But if we have a specific kind of photo book, should we not try and name it, use a different term or not? And that's another question. It's a battle that I think is very difficult because I've been working around this subject for many years now. And every single time, and even these talks are, the title of the talk has the term photo book in them. So it's pointless for me to say that perhaps we should be more specific. I think it's accepted that when we talk about photo books, we're talking about a very specific kind of production. And when I was doing the PhD, I started looking back again at research that had been done. And this study became very central to my research and my study of the relationship between photography and the book. Alex Sweetman is potentially is linked to, he's an artist bookmaker and he worked in that field, but he was very much interested in the relationship between photography and bookmaking, and he decided to write about it. And this is a publication that came after he published an article which is it's also around photo book work making in Joan Lyon's survey about the artist books. But this is it's a very small catalog that he published, which was linked to an exhibition, and I don't have much information about the exhibition, unfortunately. What he does in this very slim volume is that he tries to define different moments in the history of photo book making and tries to compartmentalize things in a way that I think is correct and works for me. I really follow his lead on this particular way of looking at the history of photo book making. So he starts by talking about 19th century books and how the photographic printing shaped that production. And then he moves on to talk about photomechanical printing. That means the introduction in the late 19th century of the ability to print directly on the page. And he moves on to then talk about early 20th century, this visual revolution that he mentions here around modernist artists using photography, and how photography also changed. And then at a certain point, he introduces the photo book work. This is very interesting to look at, this double spread, because Alex Sweetman is based in the United States, and he's here clearly shaped by a notion of photographic history that is very much also US centric. Walker Evans, Weegee, Robert Frank, all the the obvious names, but according to him, these are the founders of photo book work making. So in a sense, he is arguing that our understanding of what is a photo book stems from this production. I disagree. I think it starts a bit early, and obviously the goal of this talk is not to define that, but I would say we should go back to this period and look at this production, and the modernists are quite important in the shaping of the relationship between the use of photography on the page, but also even further back with the late 19th century production of magazines, which is really key to understand how images started, being introduced in those publications, and the juxtaposition of images to create narratives in those magazines really shaped later on modernists, because they were exposed to those magazines and those ways of creating narrative with photographs. But anyway, this is the first, time that someone really tries to look at this object and say, wait, these are different. There are different ways of doing it. There are people that look at this as the unity of the whole book is important. There are elements there that are really important and that distinguish it from like just a book with some photographs in them. And so this is based on his analysis, what defines a photo book work. So sequencing is key. The form and this unified narrative that comes out of it. Sweetman sort of goes beyond the single image logic that was present in many publications, and is thinking about the relationship between images, this inter-image relation that I mentioned there. And I think he was already looking at obviously artist books too at the same time, and photo books, and trying to say, look, this is in a way a continuum. There is an overlap. He doesn't fully do that. And that's an issue that obviously is part of research. When we are researching subjects, we try to just make sure that we try to crystallize things by making assertions about something that that are solid, so that no one questions what we're saying. But it's always complicated because there's no one way to look at something. So he does trace this historical lineage of works, and he, from early avant-garde and modernist publications, modernist, practice, and then he brings it to, mid 20th century. And one could argue that even today, we're still talking about photo book works. And just to add a bit more context, and going back to artist books, book work is a term that wasn't developed by him, by Sweetman. So Ulysses Carrion developed that term in his writing in the early 1980s and late 1970s. It was already looking at the idea of the artist book, but he started talking about book works. And the idea of the expressive unity that he is there in this quote. The message is the sum of all the material and formal elements. And I think it's, I think it is a very, very strong definition, and I think it's, at least to me, it makes complete sense, and I think it could be applied to the idea of photo book, the special kind of photo book that I've been trying to ascertain here. Probably not fully clear yet, but hopefully it will become clearer. So, but this leads to this problem, okay, as you can see here in this cloud. So I was talking about historiography as being a very sort of strong presence in our perception of the photo book and what it is, because it shapes how we view it, either through these 3 volumes by Martin Parr and Jerry Badger that present a history, and they call it a history. They don't say it's the history of the photo book, but nonetheless, it has that power. And terminology is also a binding force in, I think, historical and institutional discourse in photo book and artist book practice. So if you go back to the writing about artist bookmaking, there are many articles and even books about this whole discussion. Even if the apostrophe in artists should be before the S or after the S, or what should we call different types of publications? And this creates a very interesting instability that is, I think it can be useful, because what it shows is that we shouldn't be, trying also to just, spend our time looking at something by just focusing and trying to establish something with exact precision. Because I think the form itself, the practice itself, as I hopefully will show later, doesn't do that. So, and this is purely what I've been discussing, very academic, very much me as I said, a photo historian trying to understand this. But my experience with artists, and I will show some examples in a few minutes, is that that's not the case, because artists don't really focus on that so much. It's not as important. But this just to show the variety. And terms and definitions collide. I think that's the key thing that I want you to take out of this, is that many of the objects that we see, many of the objects that we love, don't sit neatly inside one category, and they shouldn't. And maybe we shouldn't look at this production that way. And that's also, when I was doing my studies, in a way, that's what academia expects you to do. You need to find something that will categorize something and stick to that. You cannot be, well, you should be able to do it differently, but yeah. So, and so let me just move on here. And so this is just in a nutshell what I had to deal with. So when I decided to establish a difference between what is a photographic book, the photo book as an abbreviation, and photo book work, that is, a specific type of photo book that Martin Parr and Jerry Badger were talking about, and then artist books and book works. That, according to the research, so all these definitions are according to other people's ideas. The artist book and the book work are shaped by conceptual and a deconstructive nature. But I would argue that photo books can also be categorized in that way, or some of them, So the provocation here is photo book as limiting what we do and how we discuss this specific practice? Is it productive? Even my introduction of the term photo book work, when I found it in Sweetman's work, should I just pursue that and keep going at it and saying, okay, we should call it something else? Or does it simply reinscribe new boundaries and again sets these lines that again will make people just think about this production in a specific way? So that's another level of limiting our understanding of photo bookmaking. And then part 3, and this is, I promise, the last part about this idea of the binding of the photo book, is the myth of the first. It's obviously not, when you look at research around photo books and artist books, not everyone thinks that there is a single book that is the first photo book or the first artist book. But art history, again, because it's an academic practice, as this necessity to just find these key moments and establish a canon. And I showed you Alex Sweetman's study where he talks about Walker Evans, Robert Frank, and he places them at the center of photo book work production. And canons are, again, also like terminology, binding sort of mechanisms of I say legitimacy in a way to make sure that these forms are taken seriously, and there is that necessity perhaps to do that, and understandably. So for Parr and Badger and Sweetman, this book is a foundational moment. And obviously, Parr and Badger tried to expand their, perception of and the study of photo book by going back to the 19th century. But when you read the text, they clearly don't see that production as being the special kind of photo book they talk about. They see it as maybe there are some glimpses of that, but it's here with the photographer as an artist. And this is very much linked also to the idea that the photographer is at the center of the photo book. So everything else that precedes this moment where the photograph enters the museum, and therefore it allows the photo book to become also an artistic form. So it's really interesting. And it's obviously here, when you look at this book, it's a very, well, now when we look at it, perhaps we might see it as a very conservative form of making photo books. It's that classic of, a double spread with, one image on the right side, and the other side is a white page. And it's a succession of images. And it uses the codex, so it's a very static format. I have to say, I don't have any issues with this type of book. Not all books need to be very complex and layered, and it's exploring the form. So, but is there a difference between this and what we now see in contemporary production? And I will talk about that later too. Another thing that interested me when I was looking at this narrative in photo book studies was trying to understand how the scholars of artist books saw this particular moment and these books. And that was another revelation when I was doing the PhD, because this is Joanna Drucker's The Century of Artist Books. Is a very well-known study, one of the first that really tries to capture the full history of artist bookmaking, which is quite an endeavor, very ambitious. It's really a brilliant study. And here, in this quote, she makes a clear distinction between early 20th century practice and then the commercial, practice. She calls it commercial, that emerged, later in the early 20th century, probably early to mid 20th century, photographic books seen as commercial objects. And I think that's a really interesting discussion to have, because it's that, when we think about the photo book now, which is such a niche market, so expensive to make, so it's this idea of it being commercial is really, really interesting. But she clearly places like Walker Evans and Robert Frank's books as secondary to avant-garde production. But nonetheless, then she contradicts herself to a certain point, because she says that those photographic books, that she says that they are actually artist books. And I found this really fascinating. There are only these two moments where she talks about that production. So the entire study is focused on mostly trying to ascertain the origins of artist bookmaking. And obviously not all of it linked to photography or at all in the beginning. And then she moves on to the 1960s. And that's the perception of artist books as being something that was temporarily, was done throughout, obviously, from the late 19th century onwards. But then in the 1960s, there's this sort of renaissance of it. But I think it was really interesting for me to look at this. And then part of the research was also interviewing some people. And I interviewed Joan Lyons, artist bookmaker, scholar. And I asked her about this particular quote, and I said, but and she was obviously doing artist books in the 1960s and 1970s, and I said, well, I found this quote by Joanna Drucker, and she said that photo book works or photo books were part of the discourse at the time. So, and people were looking at other things, not just those formats, but also albums, scrapbooks, magazines, and going back to sort of manuscripts and surveys in comic books and other forums, so it was very open. So it's interesting that when we reach this point where academics are writing about it, it's completely forgotten, and particularly this idea of what is commercial cannot enter this realm was really interesting to me. And so the question then for me was that if those books were circulating, and we know now that all those books were there, all the photo books that we all know that are part of the history of photo book making, why was it absent from these book surveys? And this brings me back to the mythology of the first again, I think. That's at least my perception. This idea that artist books materialized in the 1960s, or they fully materialized in the 1960s. And not everyone is of this opinion, of course. Some scholars propose an artist book practice that goes back to William Blake, for instance, in the late 18th century, William Morris, Mallarmé in the late 19th century. But other studies, and probably the majority, especially in the 1990s, argue that the historical and conceptual foundation of artist book making is rooted in the 1950s with Diderot, and then at Rocher in the 1960s, with this book being a first. It is widely propagated. I mean, I think we've reached a point now where probably is not the common perception of the form, but it's just me just talking about academic, writing about this subject, and it has evolved. But I think it's interesting that it was for art historians, in particular field of artist book studies, it was necessary to find a book where photography is not taken seriously, to then accept that the book is, part of this, can be an artistic format, can be an artistic object. And I think it is, and maybe I'm being unfair, it stems perhaps from prejudice. And I think that's at the core of it. That's my perception of it. But obviously, the authors could disagree with me, and maybe some of you might disagree with me. But in this idea that in this particular book, that photographs are completely irrelevant, and Richer defends that to a certain extent when he says what's important here is the idea that this is a book with 26 gasoline stations. He thought of the title came to his mind, and then he went out and took the photographs, and then he produced the book. So the concept comes before the photographs. But if we go back to the history of the photo book, you'll find that in the past too. So I think because that overlap didn't happen, we somehow created two separate worlds that shouldn't be separate. At least that's how I see it. But here we are talking about those two things in those terms. And even this book, there is a sequence, and that is central to the book. And he produced other volumes like that. And I think it's also about it's Richer's disavowal of photography is really key. And that then the perception of that really shaped how these books were seen. I have to say that when I went back and read Richer's, interviews, and he mentions Walker Evans and Robert Frank, for instance, and specifically the type of photography they were making, and suggesting that their approach to to the way he photographed is there to a certain point. Maybe not wasn't fully inspired by the books they made, but I think it is there. I think at a certain point it is about this book that he was interviewed by John Copeland, the artist, and he's talking about these images as as being almost they are reproduction, so they're not. He's talking about the photomechanical nature of photography, but I think we shouldn't use that to dismiss the photographic nature of the work and the links with Evans and Frank, as I said, that he very much acknowledged. And so here I'm just putting side by side Walker Evans and Richer. And I think there's something to be said about this overlap. And I think instead, if we make an effort to see the links, I think we start understanding the bridge between what happened in the 1960s with this particular book and the use of photography here, and what came before it, and the scholars and how they dealt with it. But obviously, the key point is also: do we need a first at all? Is that fruitful? And if we keep doing that, this mythology, is it something that should we pursue it or not? And as I said, this is something that changed, and I think not many people do, believe that Walker Evans was the first person to do a photo book, and that Richet was the first person to do an artist book. But academically, when you enter the field, there is this layer of, and because things are crystallized through writing, so you have to kind of go into it and excavate a little bit to find other things. So, and this leads to the second part, and I know probably that I'm already talking too much here about unbinding the photo book. So all that I've mentioned are things that when I was doing my research, I had to tackle to understand what the photo book was, how it was, studied, how it was, the perception of it was shaped by academics, the history of it, the terms that were used, and the mythology around the production. And so that led at the time, and I've done other projects later, also an exhibition about this idea of unmooring the photo book from all these anchors that I've just mentioned: the historiography, the terminology, and the mythology. And how do you do that? And the way that I found to achieve that was by looking at practice and artists. So that's also, I think, there, and I know we're here in an academic setting, but also I think it's very important to have artists talk about the work and look at what they're doing, because they express that so well by doing things. And so obviously that's when I started thinking about, okay, how are people doing these books? Because even what I was mentioning about Ed Verche, most of what I described was written by someone else, not Ed Verche. Ed Verche gave a few interviews, but he was not interested in talking about that. To a certain, he wasn't analyzing what he was doing. He was just putting it out there. And so the exhibition I mentioned that I did in Denmark at Photo Book Week, called Rebellious Photo Book, was a bit about that. Was thinking about, okay, how do we subvert this? How do we deconstruct it? Or how do people do that? And I made a selection of books. And in a sense, there's a danger here, because it can almost create a typology also of these types of books that are not, are not like the codex, that, square rectangular format, bound, very classic, but that's not the point. The point is that, things coexist. And I started looking at how the artists were looking and examining the boundaries of the page. But it's also fascinating to see how, there's and throughout, when you think you found something that is really radical and new, suddenly you can find an example that predates it. Also, that was part of what happened when I was looking at things through this prism of the practitioner. And this Ed Verche book is well known. It's the use of the Leporello, the accordion format. And it's trying, obviously, to expand this idea of the book, going beyond the codex, and taking things and the act of reading and looking at photography. And there is here structural investigation. And that's very, very important. And how it enhances, in the way I see it, the narrative that is present here, this idea that you're traveling throughout the Sunset Strip. But later on, in this case was revealed in Martin Parr and Jerry Badger's study, one of the volumes. There is this book made in Japan in 1954 that it's not an artist book at all, but this was a book that was done as a survey of these particular streets in Japan, in Tokyo, and it really follows the same format. So it's really curious to find something like that. And obviously, other people have applied the form throughout history. So and of bookmaking. So this is a very beautiful book by Ellen Douglas and Tefler Stokes that uses the accordion literally, and it's very meta. And it was done a decade after Rocher published his book. And it reproduces an accordion, so there's humor in it, obviously, with this idea. When you open the book, as you can see there, you see this landscape of green grass, and at a metaphorical level, for me at least, it's when you open it, it sort of evokes the cleansing properties of the fresh countryside air entering us when we look at this book. So it's quite a beautiful book in that sense, and it takes it to a whole new level of engaging with form, and uses photography, obviously. But I don't think we would be so much focused on the photographs in the book, but more the form of the book, which is absolutely wonderful. And also another example that I was trying to look at and thinking about how is our photo books done in a different way? Are there ways of engaging with it beyond the traditional things that I saw in Parr and Badger's volumes? Although they did have a chapter about, well, they call them artist photo books. So they made a chapter specifically about that form, which I think was counterproductive because it separated something that shouldn't be separated. But yeah, so, and I found, that very interesting too. We have here, this is the image that opened, was in the first slide, François Deschamps' Life in a Book. It's not a well-known book, unfortunately, but it's a wonderful example of someone using photography. And it's a constant use of optical illusion in the book. And it's always reminding the reader that we're handling a physical object, a book. So this book, for instance, is not part of the canon of the photo book, but I think it should. And it's part of the canon of artist bookmaking. So you can find it in some, artist book studies, but you cannot find it in the study of the photo book. And why is that? So that's the question, isn't it? Why is it not there? Maybe because that perception of, the photographer being at the center, and François Deschamps is known as an artist, and he uses photography. And we're entering a very complex discussion here that potentially we can continue after I finish. But as things progressed, and I think in the last 15 years, things have changed for photo books. And what you can see here is and I was talking to Johannes about this peak of the photo book after 2010s. That was when it was a decade after the first two volumes of the photo book history were published. There was this enormous amount of production, festivals, prizes, and things like that. And then you see people started experimenting and trying to deconstruct the photo book. And looking at the tradition of the artist book, I would say, and questioning the limits of the page. How do people, the reader, how do they engage with it? So it's really interesting that this starts emerging here. You would not see this in Parr and Badger's first two volumes, or at least probably 90-something% of the books in those two volumes are very traditional. So, and the third volume engages with that and tries to explore that a little bit. So this is Judith van Eyken's mimicry, where the page is sliced. So you see there the image black and white as it's sliced, and then you can see you have a peek preview of the following page. But this is here to connect the photographs, talking about past and present, and I think it's a really good example of. And here, a designer at work, Zubrin Kuyper, the Dutch designer that did this book. He's well known for formal experimentation in the photo book world. But these are strategies that were present in artist bookmaking, or in the 1970s. This is a good example of by Stuart Mills, where you're blocking the page, or Brumberg and Channeran also reapplying this technique in this appropriation of the Bible, where they place images on top of the text, and insert images of conflict and catastrophe, and then they underline passages of the Bible. So there's here a connection, trying to establish a connection between text image, but also sabotaging the act of reading of this very important, obviously, book, which is not originally a photographic book, but it becomes a photo book or an artist book, depending on on how you define things. Yeah, and this is Marcel Protes, someone that also is well known, and as and obviously here again, preventing the reader from accessing what is seen as the core of reading a book, text, and so you prevent that, and you immediately question the format. There are other artists that have done it. So there's a lot of formal experimentation in the last few years. This was something I was involved with. Kate Nolan's neither, and she decided to slice the book at the bottom. Those texts, the white stripes are text, and you read it, and the text doesn't match the images, or it doesn't have to. And when we did it, and it was designed also by Zuber and Kuiper, and what was interesting that a few years later I found this book which does the exact same thing, but we had no idea that it was there. So it's also interesting to see that. And other people in recent years have gone to the extent of really thinking about inflicting literal pain, and making the reader interact with the book in a way that it destroys it. Here, this is a project that's really interesting by Tony Amengual, where you need a knife to open the pages of this book. It is obviously, this book is about the economic crisis in Spain. There are conceptual layers at work here. The folds are not open when you buy it, and you need to damage the book. And when I spoke to him about this, this was published in 2014, at that moment where photo books were seen as the peak of photography, and everyone was making a book, and obviously the commercial side was very important. And he was also trying to make a comment about how people were so precious about books, photo books in particular, and how when people bought them, either bought two copies, one that was sealed, another one that was read, things like that happened and probably still happen. And then maybe I can show you just how, it's a very short video of how this book works. I think it's really... So the colors of the Spanish flag, obviously, as you can see. So it's all... So some people bought the book and didn't open the book at all, didn't cut it. Other people I know have done it. So it depends. I think that agency of the reader is quite important. Yeah. Okay. And then I did, I did this, it was published 2 years ago, a study, no, last year, so lost track of time, a book on the history of the Portuguese photo book. And during the research, we found this book published in the 1970s, 1975, right after the revolution. This is an anarchist book. It's based on Mao's Little Red Book. What I think is funny is there's a bullet hole that traverses the book at the top, and it's the pages, because it's an anarchist book. They're also the numbering of the pages doesn't follow a logical sequence, so you go from page 18 to page 54 and then go back to page 12, so to subvert this whole idea of reading it. It is a very graphic book. It has photography, writing, so it's a really interesting example of someone exploring what is a photographic book and going beyond this traditional format, and this was also linked to the moment, the political moment. When we think about the revolution, we obviously there were graffitis everywhere. There was so much information, and I think this book is trying to mimic that. And it's a protest book to a certain point. I mean, I could read, well, you can see what is there, but it says that it's a monument to the main product produced by the battle of production. So that's what it says there. But all this book is very provocative in that sense. And more recently, people like exploring, the page in such way, in this particular way. For instance, Anu Kruitov, this book can only be read when you open it this way. All these fold outs need to be opened to read the book. So you cannot read when you buy it, you cannot read it. You really need to sort of open everything, unfold it like this origami structure to read it. And then in Portugal, Dini Shanch published this book called Plastic in 2019. All the pages of this book are made of plastic, or they're acetate, and they are transparent. So when they're juxtaposed, you cannot read the book. So you have to go. He provides a blank sheet of paper that you put in, and then you can see the image. But when you remove it, you're not able to see it. And this is a book about consumption, and the production, plastic, and all the issues, political, social issues around that particular subject. And other people have taken it to disrupting the cover. Practitioners also rethinking the photo book in this way. Stephen Gill is well known for his photo books, and he radically here cover the book with soil. So because the images inside this book, the reproduced images, are Polaroids that were buried for a period of time in Hackney, and then he took them from the soil and photographed them, and then he produced a book, and then he decided to actually make the book very dirty. It comes with a sleeve, but the thing is, when you buy it, it's so uncomfortable to touch it because it's soiled. So it's quite repulsive actually to handle this book. It's quite interesting, and I thought that was really a brilliant idea. And it brings an envelope with a C print that you can bury too, so you can mimic the act. But this is also not new again. When we go back to the artist book history, and we start looking for examples. This is a very well-known book by Guy Debord and Oscar Jorn, a Danish artist. And the cover of this book is sandpaper. So you can imagine also the problematic nature of handling that cover, and how it immediately makes you think, about the form. So that's really, really fascinating. And Paul Gaffney here. It's very unassuming when you look at it. This project is about well, at the core of it is about the idea of walking and photographing. But the books are separate because one of them is as photographs taken during the day, and another one as photographs taken at night, nightfall, under the light of the full moon. So this dichotomy between day and night, moon and earth, is present through the magnetic nature of the covers. So they're interlocked, so they are sort of magnetically linked. So it's and they come together. So it's a really, really interesting way of conceptualizing the book and linking it to the photographic series, but making sure that the form is linked to the book and the central idea of the photographs. And then other people just have these ideas of that sometimes not successful, I would say. I always use this book as an example of how you should not pursue certain ideas. This is a book by Ishizuka Gentaro called Pipeline Alaska. There is a hardcover version, and then he did a special limited edition that is a paperback that comes inside a tube. The problem with it, and it's not the end of the world, obviously, but when the book was rolled and placed inside the tube, it destroyed the book because it's never flat when you take it out. And I think design wise, it's not the best idea, but conceptually it makes sense. And I think because he photographs the Alaska pipeline, and he's trying to connect, the series with the actual form of the book. So, but again, it's just, this goes beyond really traditional ideas of photo book making that I was just mentioning in the canon that I was mentioning. Again, this is something that when you look at it, you can go back to artist bookmaking and see very many examples of that are linked to ideas of the ready-made and book as sculpture. So it is present there. And this is a classic by Robert Filou, which is it's an exhibition in itself, but it's also a publication. But then there are no pages, or there are pages depending on how you look at it. So it's really fascinating. And then we reach a point where we can even start questioning if the object is a book, and I'm almost finishing here. So here we have Sun Young Kim's schema. It's really interesting. It's a very radical approach. It's this book, if you want to call it that, I think it is, dismantles the natural structure of what we see as a book. It's like a game. These photographic blocks create sort of narratives depending on how you place them. There are more. Here the photograph only shows 3, but there is a series of blocks, and it's almost like a Matryoshka doll. So it's a block within a block. But and you can create narratives with it. It's really interesting, and it's linked to memory and how we our fragmented memory, and so the fragmentation of the visual, the photographs used to create these blocks. So she's talking about that. So that was my sort of, when I was looking at this while I was doing the PhD, looking at that. But then one question that I remember when I spoke to some people, shall not name names, about these books and how they suddenly, in this period, lots of artists started experimenting with form in the photo book world. And then an immediate backlash ensued. People saying, oh, but this is about photography. This is not about, this is too gimmicky. People are just putting things in books that make no sense. Why are we adding things when it should be about the photographs? So that's the key question. Is disruption for disruption's sake enough? Or is that the case, actually? Is it just for disruption's sake? Or should we be, more open to that experimentation? And in a way, should we just let these two worlds coexist? Or, where, or, well, more than two worlds, but coexist. There might be differences between things. The materiality of these books is different, the way they're made, but are they that different? Are they not, artistic proposals? Is there not an artistic agency here at work? So what distinguishes them? Perhaps, yes, of course, there are differences, but at the core, are they're not part of the same lineage of someone looking at, bookmaking and exploring that. Yeah. So, and I think maybe I'll stop there if that's okay, because I feel that I'm just talking too much. Uh, I know that I have a few slides, but Johannes, I cannot hear.
Yeah, no, I don't think you're talking too much because it's super interesting. And there's still plenty of room to talk. I would be happy to hear if you still have slides. I would be really happy.
Yeah, okay.
hear
It's
what
just
you have to
mindful,
say.
I don't want people feel that I'm just talking. I know it's a lot, so it's quite so. And so, and okay, so I'll try and just there are not many slides left,
Yeah.
and maybe I should actually bring the final slides because they also are quite important in terms of pointing out other people's work, more recent work, and I think that's okay. And so when I was doing this, which was really, really cool, a cool thing. This is a diagram I produced in, I think, 2000, probably 14, 15, I think, 10 years ago, for when I was doing the PhD. And I still look at it, I think, okay, this is really the product of an academic mind, trying to make sure everything is, established and with a line and with a continuum, and putting things in boxes and see if they make sense. And I think it still does. I like the idea of it being a historical line where things emerge. The only issue, obviously, that I have is that, well, here, as you can see, things continue. So when I start with the photo book continues to the present. When I start with the artist book, it continues to the present. The artist book there should not be starting there. Should start in before, as I said, in the 18th century or even before that. So I think it's this is shaped by what I discussed about how artist book scholarship, was telling me. This is when it started. This is really when things, became, key for the artists making books. This the democratic view of books as being accessible to everyone, an art form that was accessible to everyone instead of, the paintings and the museums and the galleries. So it's really fascinating. And just the final section is about the futures, what futures are possible, and especially in terms of scholarship. This is something I've addressed recently. I wrote a chapter for a book called Talking About Photo Books, if I'm not mistaken here, published by Photobook Week Harus in Denmark, the festival. And it was based on a presentation that I did about the historiography of the photo book, so studies that dealt with the subject. And there's so many things that have been published, especially in the last 15 to 20 years, that are important. Uh, um, and what the question for me is also, if practice, as I showed you, developed, while remaining less constrained by strict definitions, styles, if artists can do it, so academia should be able to do it. And if I didn't talk about other, studies, because I mentioned Horacio Fernandez, there's someone else that maybe I should mention, Manfred Heiting, a German scholar, collector of photo books, and he has published extensively around the history of the photo book. And all the studies are quite extraordinary because they focus on different forms of printed matter. He doesn't look purely at the book. He looks at magazines. He looks at ephemera that uses photography. And then more recently, Ivan Vartanian published one of the first study about Japanese photographic magazines, which is quite an incredible study. It is very niche, but it really demonstrates that the magazine was a central platform for photographers to not only show photographs, but also to think about photographic narrative. And as I said, when I was talking about the division, historical division, when things emerge, the magazines in the late 19th century are really important to understand narrative and sequencing and editing, because when photographs were printed, finally could be printed with ink on the page and mixing text and image simultaneously instead of before that they had to be glued on the page, so they had to be produced separately, and then because there was no way of doing it, that really shaped things. Text started disappearing, and we became a visual, culturally more visual, and that inevitably shaped modernness. And so that is key, and I think there are other areas that we should look into. But what happened in the recent years is the shift in looking at other areas that are quite important. So these are well-known books. The two I'm going to just show you now, the 10 by 10 photo books, based in the United States. A group of people that look at the history of photo books, and they're trying to go beyond the established scholarship. In this particular case, looking at women and the production of photo books by women. This is the first attempt. This one is about contemporary photo book production. And this is the most recent one. This is historical, and these are critical and very important. One could argue that they suffer from the same problems that all surveys suffer, that they are selective, that they don't show everything. Of course, they don't engage that much with this other side of, you know, that is the artist book. Because if you go into that world, you'll see so many, you know, books that are not here. But in a way, it's trying to respond, you know, to that first moment, to the canon, especially Parent Badger, and saying, you know, it's recovering marginalized voices, especially women artists, but also, you know, it focuses on other things. And someone that I think is important, and it was mentioned already, Matt Johnston. He was part of these conversations last time. This is a very, very interesting book, and I think it's really important. He's looking at how photo books are read, circulated, and he's talking about, as Emmanuel was saying, you know, this digital and post-digital era, and how, you know, this moment is, you know, very important to think about this specific format and the object itself, and how it is circulating, and what you know, what is, you know, photo book production now, and you know, and he really raises questions about, you know, audience, production, cost, you know, accessibility, which are really important. And, you know, and I have to say that most of my discussion, as you saw, it's very much Western biased. So I'm not, you know, there are some exceptions, and this is something that we also should be aware of, that it is very much Western centric. Not that photo books were not made and artist books in other geographies, but, you know, and there are people looking at it. So although here I was saying about, when you talk about digital and post-digital, I like to talk about a little bit about the post-canonical moment that we live in. I think we have reached that point where we established the foundations of something in a limited way, but I think we reached a moment perhaps that we can now talk about all these things and these objects in a more open way, and look at what can be done. And this is very much linked to Matt's ideas of, you know, making things public, and maybe forgetting some definitions, and, you know, be more critical, engage more with artists, potentially listen more to that, and not, you know, impose so many, you know, expectations on people producing it. And you know, when I was teaching, it was very much about that, and I also tried to do that. Although I spent hours talking about the things I was, you know, I presented to you. At the end, it was, you know, more fruitful to engage with the artist in tutorials and talking about what they were doing, and obviously always keeping in mind the context and the past, and, you know, what you could describe as rules, but those are meant to be broken anyway. So the final provocation is, can the photo book survive as an accessible democratic medium? Because it is not easy to produce them. It is very expensive. I would say it's not fully accessible. And these are questions that I think Matt asks, and I think other people have been asking. So that's another layer of complexity to it. So, and that brings me to the conclusion now of the talk.
Super nice, and very much over time. But I think it was such a joy listening to you. I didn't really have the heart to cut you off.
No, it's okay. I know I tend to talk too much, so.
But I think this gives a really good base for further discussions.
Yeah, of course.
I have a lot of questions. I want to just encourage everybody in the audience, if they have thoughts and questions, you can raise the hand.
Yes,
or just
and disagreements, please. Disagreements too. I love disagreements. I love.
Well, one thing I've been thinking about the local, maybe now, like looking at different kind of national histories of photos, and like how they are written. And then I was thinking about like in these days, like the competitions, and they have such a big role in which books kind of have and kind of get recognition and get visibility and are kind of distributed, and also what kind of rules are in this kind of competition, especially now in Finland. We've been thinking about or there's been a bit critique of this photo book of the year, and they have this limit that only books that have edition over 200 are able to apply, and
Right.
kind of missing what are the canon kind of that we are writing, and I've been curious about myself doing some research about and around this topic in a way, like what is kind of and how are we writing the national histories of this medium.
Yeah, that's
You weren't covering kind of I've been thinking about or
no,
addressing
that's really interesting.
yeah
Because I came across something very recently. So you're saying that in that particular case, minimum of 200 copies for it to be considered
yes
as a, but I've come across something else that is more artist book oriented. That is, it needs to be very limited to be an artist book. So
Yeah.
there are these two worlds that is
Yeah.
so interesting. Not everyone obviously, follows those rules, but I think I've also encountered that problem when we were doing the Portuguese photo book study, where we had to define what is the limit in terms of production to include it in the study. Is something that is only 5 copies, should we be putting this in the study? But it's such a strange discussion because obviously it doesn't really define the work itself.
No.
If it's, the point was that if it's good, it's good. If it's meant to be part of it, if it has a value, and it has obviously. So, but I think it's really fascinating that by doing that, we are saying, okay, so in this case, particularly the photo books is something that needs to be, produced in a larger scale to be seen as that. So if it's not, then probably it's not. And I think it raises really interesting questions. Yeah. So
Yeah, and I think it was good you addressed, and actually never articulated and thought about it myself that when I'm talking about photo books, I'm also indeed thinking about a certain kind of photo book.
of course. And there,
and-
I mean, it's like, I feel like a bit like, in Cervantes, Don Quixote going against the windmills, because it's kind of like, why would I say, don't say photo book, or because it's implied that it is a specific form,
Yeah, but of course it's not for everyone. Maybe it's something that we discussed like before we started the talk also, that this is kind of a super kind of niche thing, and this is a bit kind of nerdy in a way. I think most of us in this room now is kind of have a lot of kind of unspoken rules on how we perceive things.
But no, absolutely. I think for me, and when I did it, it was a necessity because I was doing an academic study, and we have to find these definitions. But as I said, for an artist, when I speak to many artists when they're doing books, and of course they will say they're doing a photo book, and I could look at it and say, oh, this falls into a category that has already been established. That is not really the photo book as we name it. It's maybe like a sculptural book or these other terms that emerge. But that's fine. I think it's really about context, about and it's not, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have these discussions. And, I remember that in one of the previous meetings we had that, Emmanuel was very much about, no, you should go and talk about it because it's important. And I think it's true. It causes so much debate, and and it raises these immediate, questions about how we define things. Yeah.
And then one thing I think was, I think could open up a broad discussion also. There was this Philou had this kind of, I was thinking about this relationship with exhibition and book, like how an object can how it can work, and because I think quite often you see, I think it's problematic to display photo books like under glass, and you see kind of this kind of setups, and because kind of the books are made to use, and
of course,
but you see those, especially kind of in historical context, when you have kind of really fragile objects that you're not kind of allowed to touch.
Yeah, but it defeats the purpose and the nature of the book, that is to be handled and to be read. So well, not all books actually, because there are some examples of people that make books that are inaccessible, that are locked, that are not. So I think it depends on what you want to do with it, but that is an artificial sort of process where the book is protected, is made safe, so it does the grubby hands of the reader don't touch it because we don't understand how valuable it is, and we just try. But again, it goes against the nature of it, that it's meant to be like, and there's something to be said about. I mean, but I just say libraries are very good because libraries, well, they care sometimes, but most of them try to say, no, the book should be on the shelf. So they go to the extent of saying it's, can only be consulted in the library. You cannot take it home, but at least you can touch it while you're in the building. And sometimes you can't. But I mean, that all, it's because librarians don't see the book. They see the book as something that needs to be touched. What is the point of having a book in a library if no one can look at it? So in a museum, because it's a museum, you're not allowed to touch art. You're not allowed to. So it's about that context. And then when you do a portable exhibition, like Philou did, is saying, oh, wait. So I'm doing this to be, circulated, and an exhibition can be done anywhere. So in that sense, I could argue that all books, or artist books or photo books, there are portable exhibitions also. So that's true of them too. So, but there's a tendency to say, oh, the wall is different from the book, of course. But it's also a way of disseminating the series in a different way, potentially. But, so they have a bit of that too in them too. Yeah, in some sense. Yeah.
I want to give the voice also to others. Is there any?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I have a dog that decided to.
It doesn't actually. We don't actually hear it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that's good that my phones are filtering.
Maybe I'll say something.
Oh yeah, of course.
No, it was great. I mean, it's a difficult job to do, to try to define what the photo book is, because it's it's different things to different people. So, and it's important to do so. So you were one of the first to try to define it. Matt Johnson was as well.
Yeah.
And maybe to kind of see it in a bigger framework, in a way, there's the issues are is because we think of a photo book and that relates it directly to the photography world. But in a way, as you demonstrated through your various approaches and perspectives, so the history of the photo book is at the crossroad of the history of photography, of course, but also of the history of publishing and of the history of artist book, which relate, and they all correlate, but they all have distinctive histories in a way, and how they've been influenced through the ages from the different kind of technical revolution, of the printed press, then of the personal computer, then of the digital revolution. So in a way, it's always a problem to try to find one canon that works for everything. And secondly, why should it be? I think we're getting this kind of anthropocentric way of saying, history is linear and things are one thing and not the other. Yeah. So in that sense, it's interesting. And culturally, so in a way, if we take the artist book, the histories were written, of it by, you name them, Johanna Drucker in France, you had, what was her name?
Meuglin-Decroix, yeah.
Yeah, and Meuglin-Decroix. Here you had Clive Philpott as well, but who comes from library and collecting. And then you had a lot of artist bookmakers like Simon Cutt and Hamilton Finlay, because if you wanted to be an artist book on the margins, to kind of conventional publishing, then you had to be self-critical and kind of define the medium. Maybe the issue with the photo book, as you said, is Parr and Badger kind of defined the canon, not necessarily willingly, because they were already very established figures, in the British world of photography. Yeah. And they loved books. So their 3 volumes became the canon.
Yes.
And it became the history, the canon, and defined what was and what wasn't, but through a very subjective, in a way, kind of it was a completely subjective choice.
Mm.
And they became the gatekeepers as well, because if you were included in their book, that's it. Your book would sell out very quickly and you became part of the canon. So what David Campany tried to do to kind of, in his definition, was to challenge that a bit, but still within the world of photography, not trying to go back to the source. You know, you mentioned, you know, McCausland and others. So I think that's maybe at the source, is that the canon has been defined, you know, completely subjectively.
Yeah, I think so, and it goes a little bit back to that. It's almost yeah, this mythology around those volumes also in particular, not just the
Exactly.
first, but
Yeah.
those three volumes have that weight that is, and I agree that it's, yeah, I think it was unintentional, partially perhaps. It was, yeah, and then they became a
Yes.
monster of sorts that
Yes.
took over. Yeah, it's really interesting.
But they never tried to deny it or tried to say, you know, they kind of accepted it as
Yeah, of
that's
course, and I
fine.
think
Yeah.
that's true. Yeah, but you know what? It's interesting now because those volumes have. It's been now 20 years, and I think they're out of print in a way. So it'll be interesting what will happen. You know, but
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
who would dare do the same thing? I think that's the question also, because that's
And
also the point of, yeah.
well, because as you say, academically, it's not kind of acceptable to do so.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
and your question was interesting. Your question about your provocation. If they hadn't done it, what would have happened?
Yes.
Because what gave them, you know, this aura was their reputation at the time, you know, because they were, and both interesting thinkers, and Badger, you know, great writer as well. So,
Yeah.
so they were automatically chosen as that, which means, and that's what Matt in his book is quite interesting, is try to reconnect it to the three histories of publishing, artist book, and photography, and see where they meet and how they meet. And trying to see the book maybe as something more than just an object in a way. If we were asking different questions, if we were asking for each book, what is the intention, the purpose, and the context, then it would allow us to accept all the various definitions of photo books.
No, absolutely. This overlap is constant, yes, depending on, you know, how you approach it, the methodologies, and how you know,
Yeah.
your context, and how you know, the thinkers you're using to look at them. And so this is all, yeah, very much part of the fabric of studying this specific, you know, production. Yeah.
So yes, to see it beyond the art object. So publishing as an artistic practice, but also a form of publishing that does, you know, making public is important, how you disseminate.
Yeah.
But then further, the book as an event, you know, what happens once the book has been disseminated? What role can it have? Like now, gathering people to discuss what it is. And, you know, I'm sure everybody here would have a different kind of reason, purpose, and interest in making a photo book in a way. So to arrive at I think, at a plurality of definitions and canons, but one which is critical and that takes on the history of it is important, I think. Yes, so...
Yeah, no, I would agree.
Yes, no, that was in agreement with you, but trying to
Yeah, no, of
see
course,
from,
yeah.
yes. From outside. Yeah.
I had a kind of a new or question or something related to this kind of making public. And maybe I'm just curious to see how things are in your respective countries with, because kind of at least here in Finland, the photo book is not very accessible. We're speaking about libraries. It's if you have it, it's quite difficult to really kind of only a few places. I would say maybe the photo book or the library at the photo museum in Helsinki, and there also you have to kind of it's open to everyone, but you have to kind of contact them beforehand and kind of agree on a appointment, and they kind of get maybe a wider grasp of the photo book, but they also don't maybe acquire so much new books. But if you look at the national libraries, there's not so much maybe contemporary photo books, and because I mean, as we spoke, it is kind of a niche thing. How do you feel like how if I mean, especially thinking about students and new people and that don't maybe they're not maybe networked in, and they don't know kind of have this kind of a lot of things happening online, kind of you kind of see things, and but if you really want to kind of be surrounded by books and kind of get this feeling and get really kind of see and get like a physical understanding also of the history, I think it also kind of needs this kind of local hubs in a way where people also can gather, and where there is kind of space of sharing information and such. And it's a lot thing that I've been thinking about a lot, like here locally, and I'm trying to kind of open up my personal library and kind of inviting people to come there and kind of engage them in discussions. But yeah, I'm just curious to see and to hear about your experiences in different places.
I think, well, in my particular case, I did work in higher education. As I said, I think the libraries at the universities that I worked at, most of them provide access and allow the books to be handled, even when they're in special collections. Their students need to be careful and so on. But I think that the core of libraries, there's still that intention that the books are there to be consulted and handled. They're not a static object that needs to be protected. Otherwise, it would be pointless to have them. Of course, there are these forces that have made things complicated when we start thinking about the market at work and how things sell. And Emmanuel was talking about how the canon then made books so expensive that no one is able to touch them because no one wants to put a book that is £3,000 in the hands of a student. So which I think is a mistake, because I think, why not? That's another discussion. And even I'm thinking about my experience in London, where you have so many places. It's really a luxury, where you have the V&A, you have Tate, the library, the art library. Accessibility exists. I know the Victoria and Albert Museum, the National Art Library, allows you to handle books. And Tate is it's more difficult. It's interesting. It's less, it's accessible, but less so. I know that they just bringing back the whole thing to what I was talking about. Martin Parr sold his collection to them, and I think the goal was to make it very public and accessible. That unfortunately didn't happen, but I think it's still there. It was cataloged, so you can go and look at the books. I think. And then obviously it has to do with probably funding and things like that. So it gets things more complicated. But I feel that, universities have a really important role, at least in the UK. So the reality, I think here is that one. In Portugal is a bit different, because there are institutions that have collections. I mean, most of them are, very focused on, I'm thinking about Gulbenkian, that has a really good library focused on just art. So you can find things there, but there are more barriers, I would say. But I think and then private collections, perhaps that's another way of accessing these things. But then there are projects, I guess. Matt, since I'm mentioning again, because he had this photo book club project, it was amazing. These books were circulated in a box and would travel around the world. So that's one way of making them accessible. I do one thing. I tried throughout these last 2 decades to buy always a copy of a well-known book that is not perfect. And not because I think I have a copy of William Klein's New York, for instance, that doesn't have a dust jacket, that is really quite, battered. And so I think these were, maybe I should call it it is the photo book itself, but it's almost a working copy that, I can give someone and don't have an issue with the fact that it's going to be handled. Maybe there is room for that a little bit. I thought about that at a certain point, that should all be creating, when these books are handled so much that it doesn't matter anymore. And libraries have them. There are really expensive books in libraries that are completely not destroyed. They've been loved and they've been read so much that they've gone beyond that preciousness. So I think that's great that they exist. I think it's very important to focus on that, perhaps too, that we should make space for those books instead of focusing purely on having the perfect object. Yeah.
Yeah, and as you said,
Well,
it's especially now with collectors, you have buying
Yes.
2 copies. You have one in the shelf and one that kind of one object that you use. Yeah.
I think that's where the history of artist book can be interesting,
Mm.
because it all started by small collective and individuals kind of taking on upon them to circulate them, to organize book fairs and cafes and gatherings and build their collections.
Mhm.
And often working with the patronage of a collector.
Mhm.
There are always people collecting and interested in sharing their collections, but also with, yes, university or certain public libraries are great for that. So if you are in any university, get in touch with your archivist and librarian, because there are treasures there that are not really seen. So you can see some of Ruches, you can see at UCA we have quite, and part of bookRoom we really isolated them and make them visible. Then bookRoom has built a collection of all the books which have been made either by students or researchers, and that becomes very interesting. Then there's archives of people who donate their archives as well, which are between collection and work and dummies. So that's a very interesting, yes. And then it's all the things we do, like this project, what Reflektor does, what Photobook Finland. I think Alessandro Ludovico with his mobile libraries, and there's some. So I think it's really, because the history of the photo book is relatively young compared to the artist book. So that's how, over the years, then these projects connect and developed and then get kind of bought or given to. Beaubourg has in Centre Pompidou in Paris has an amazing collection and works a lot with a national library there, which has dedicated librarian and an amazing collection. Then you have more regional ones like le Centre des Livres d'Artistes as well in the center of France, which is the second biggest collections of artist book and photo books and ephemeras. So these, it's a rhizomatic things that grows.
Mhm.
And an anecdote, I've just been, maybe one of you is interested, one of you Source magazine has emailed me offering their whole collection they have over 300 books that has been sent to them for reviews over the past 15 years. They cannot keep them. And they're offering me to UCA and bookRoom for, I think, £6,000 or a price. I have no budget at the moment. Universities in the UK are struggling a bit, but that's so that's an amazing kind of resource that it would be great if you could go somewhere. It's not a big investment. And find a way so that it could go somewhere for everybody to see it. No, Bruno Sechol as well from Self-Published Be Happy has an amazing collection as well. That who did he? Where is it housed now?
Maison Européenne in Paris.
Yeah.
They bought it.
But for a long time he was looking for a place for it. So that's
at the map. Yeah, I don't know if people in the audience have other examples or questions or
yes.
How is it looking in Vienna?
Um, I think it's actually more difficult to find books, photo books, and to even locate them. I mean, of course, museums you can go, but it's really also more artist books. I don't know, maybe the just newly founded photo museum will have a new focus on it, but otherwise, like I would. Like the Westlicht Museum, I would go there, but it's not really very accessible. So, of course, it is an issue how you get hold of the books and really, more broadly talk about it and discuss it. I mean, having it so limited, it is very difficult. And actually also finding the things is also like the individual books inside any collections is also, I think, quite a challenge, of course. So yeah, you're always happy if you find interesting leads somewhere, and then you can follow these. So also, Jose, I really liked a lot of the books I hadn't known. So I'm really excited that you presented them. I mean, I feel it's been such a rich talk. I would like to discuss like at least a week all the questions that you asked. I mean, no, I can't really pick out anything in particular, but I mean, I really enjoyed the idea of that we are at a post-canonical moment. I totally agree with you that we like kind of we don't anymore need to justify that the photo book is an artistic medium. So actually now we can relax and look at more interesting things. And so yeah, I think it's like the way you also emphasize that it's a performative act, that we can put emphasis on this or looking at different histories like the magazines that are totally oblivious in the photo book context, which is absurd in a way, because everything builds on our understanding of how text-image relations work. But it's still within the photo book community, it's not done a whole lot. Yeah. So I think like critical discussions for photo books is still something that I look forward to having more, and that's why I also think that Johannes' initiative is fantastic, and you really contributed in a great way. So I hope there's really more opportunities to follow up on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, I agree, and I think it is true. We reached a point where we can obviously have discussions that go beyond that canon that I mentioned, but also maybe it raises also questions that are quite existential. Where should we go? What are we doing? How do we do it? I think this is also an incredible space to do that, and expanding things by looking at the past, but also thinking about how do we move on and talk about this production and the history of and engaging with all those things. So yeah, I think I completely agree with you. The perception I have is that the world is complicated, so the fact that we are here, it's such a wonderful thing to be here and having these discussions. I think it will be again, because there was this, as I said, this peak of I experienced that where photo books were so important and people discussed them so much, and then things stabilized. I prefer to see it that way. Lots of people are quite negative and say, "Oh, are photo books still important?" Of course they are. In the same way that artist books went through cycles, and Emmanuel was saying, obviously, that when they emerged as being in this democratic form, but that was also, and I think at a certain point that was seen, it was co-opted, and suddenly it became so complicated also to deal with those objects because they were co-opted by the system, and they became expensive again, and so we're always battling. So I think but you, Vreni, looking at the children's photo books and that particular production is something again, but looking at, I mean, I now just veered into like a complete new research around HIV/AIDS and the representation through the photo book and the magazine. But with the tools I have now, I don't make a distinction between photo books and magazines and zines and circulation of photographic images about the subject through different printed matter that has photographs. So I think that's more fruitful now because hopefully we've learned from what has been described as a very static and subjective form of looking at things, which is great because it catalyzes new questions and creates new avenues. Yes, Emmanuel.
There's an interesting question by
Yes.
Emily Selborn.
No.
Emily, would you like to speak? Who asked? I think it was yes.
Yes. Sorry. Yes, I was quite interested. Well, thank you very much, Jose. It's been really very exciting to hear you, and I feel very stimulated. I live in Finland, and I very much appreciate the libraries in Finland. I live in Turku, and the library has a very good stock of photography books. I'm very impressed and delighted. But that's a side thing. But yes, Emmanuel, yes, I caught the end of a discussion. I think it was David Campany talking about the language of how does one review a photo book? How does one judge it, whether it's good or bad, or whether it's relevant, or whether that is a growing kind of concern, because is anyone fit to judge or what is the language of classifying a photo book that has worked or whatever? I think it's quite exciting to explore that. Of course, also, yes. I mean, the onslaught of the zine world is that the new form of the photo book, or is that the future? Is very cost effective. It's very the Photographers Gallery in London is starting to have zines on sale in their bookshop. Is that the way it's going to go? And also there are deep concerns about the materials that are used for photo books, and how do we have a responsibility to choose the materials that are used to reduce the landfill and all sorts of things. There's millions of books that are pulped and going into landfill, and there's a whole all that world. But as photographers like myself, I would love to create a book, and there's also all the business of self-publishing and opening up that world. It's quite different nowadays, and who's making the choices, and is something self-published or designed by art designers, or it becomes a design feature, and the content is subsidiary to the actual design of the physical design of the book. I mean, these are all really interesting. Anyway, thank you very much, Jose. It's been really a delight to hear this.
Thank you.
It's obviously a very lively community, and it's been very nice to tune in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Emily. I know you raised really important points, and I think it's well, that's why we have this type of forum, is to think about those things and question them and try and find answers. Emmanuel is saying that Matt Johnston does talk about the criticism in his book. There have been attempts, I think the Book Art Center in the United States did a publication that centered around criticism of artist books. Recently, they did 3 issues. It didn't go further. It's a bit funding again is an issue. There have been attempts to Source Magazine was already mentioned. They have every issue comes with reviews of photo books. There are a few people writing about that. Is there a structured way of doing it? Matt proposes something, but other people have different approaches. The question is, how do you do it? I think it's a complex thing. It's something that needs to be discussed and more promoted, I would say. But Aperture had the photo book review, which lasted for a long time, but that stopped, and now they only have a section in the magazine, smaller. So these things are cyclical, and I think that's what also we need to learn is that as much as things are happening, they will change, they will shift, and that's a good lesson. I think when you look at the photo books and artist books, is that everything goes through cycles. Everything that flourishes eventually shifts, changes, or disappears, reemerges again. So it's being aware of that. I think also it's key to be aware of those things. I feel at the moment, I think all options are there. And the way I see it is that I agree that people are doing different things and they are aware that there are different ways of approaching this, specific way of doing art and using photography in particular. Obviously, we're talking about the use of photography in book form. That's not just what, exists, but in that particular field, I think depending on the project, and that's very much so what we do in education is thinking about the project itself and what would suit that project. That's one of the discussions that we tend to have with students is, do you really need to do a book? Would a zine, be more suitable, or would this be like maybe more a digital, project or so on and so on? So there are different ways of approaching it. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, and everything being cyclical now is we're coming to end of a cycle of the talk. But I think I think we can still, if somebody has some ending comments or one last question, I think there is room for that. But otherwise, I think it's time to end. But as Rennie said, I mean, I also feel like we could spend here a week, and that's always a nice feeling that you feel like things are kind of left in the middle. But so we're gonna continue the talks on Saturday. So for that hunger, there is some food.